Hello, folks. Welcome to Season 5 of Inside TechCom with Zahra Mutabana. This season, we are focusing on tools, tips, and strategies to elevate your craft. Let's dive right in. Hello, folks. Welcome to another episode of Inside TechCom with Zahra Mutabana. Today, I have Kieran Morgan. He's an author and an entrepreneur. He's also the founder of Boffin Education. He's passionate about applying his diverse skill set in leadership, operations, and documentation to challenge the building of knowledge business. He has published Technical Writing Process, and the second edition was released recently, and we will touch upon that as well. With that, Kieran, welcome to my show.
Thanks, Zara. Great to be in your show.
Thank you. How are you doing?
I'm a little sleepy at the moment. I have a newborn baby who's a week old now. And my 1.5-year-old is just in a bit of an adjustment phase. So yeah, you mentioned before, you could see the dark circles and 100%.
I appreciate you taking the time out to spend with me away from your newborn. I would not have agreed to it, but thank you so much for giving us the time. So Kieran, tell us a little about yourself.
In terms of my background and journey, well, right now, I manage an education and publishing company called Boffin Education. And we're a little different to, existing education companies that just do training and existing publishing companies that just publish books. We're trying to bring those worlds together and publish books and do courses. So that's where I am right now. We love, evidence-based education. We're really passionate about that. So we're all about using principles that are kind of grounded in cognitive psychology. So that's where I'm at right now. And you are one of my authors, Zora. So working on technical documentation management book. So that's fantastic. We love to do things in teams. Look, in terms of where I was before, yeah, I've had a lot of roles and really diverse roles. And my last gig was I was doing program management for my state education department here in Australia, which is a really interesting experience for a couple of years, helping them transform their business model, their operating model. Before that, I was a senior manager in operations and governance at Telco. And then before that, for about 10 years, I was doing contracting in all sorts of things. So documentation, tech writing, process analysis, and project management as well. And also tech docs project management.
That is a very diverse background. But first, I want to acknowledge that, yes, we are on the team of authors working on our next book. Thanks to Felicia, a shout out to her that she got me introduced to you. Without her, I wouldn't have known you. I'm so grateful for that introduction. And I'm here today working with you, and I'm really looking forward to our journey. And also acknowledging the amount of information and knowledge that I have gained just working with the spectacular team that I'm on. So thank you for that opportunity, Kieran. You shared your background with us. You talked about program management, doing contracting, all of that. For the benefit of my listeners, I want to dive a little bit into what does program management mean, because I honestly get confused when I hear program management, project management, product management. And since you've dabbled in all of these three, it would be great for us to just tease those apart for our benefit.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess it depends who you talk to. It means different.
Of course.
Of course. So, program management to some people and the Project Management Institute is someone who manages multiple projects, so who has project managers reporting to them. But in some other fields, a program is a project, right? It's just any kind of endeavor. And, obviously product management, we're all familiar with because lots of tech writers write product documentation. So hopefully your audience is familiar with what product managers do. They make a lot of work for tech writers and project managers.
Yes. Actually, they are our bread and butter. They are our job security. So we ensure that product managers have work for us.
Absolutely. And they like to stand over your shoulder and watch whilst you're literally writing documentation in some cases.
Yep. I've been fortunate. They worked with me. Fortunately, nobody's looking over my shoulder, making sure I'm writing. It's been a very collaborative effort with my product managers. So I guess I'm lucky with that. So program management, you said it's similar to project management. It's really managing projects, but different industries may refer to it differently. Did I get that right?
Yeah. Yep.
As technical writers, although we are on I will say majority companies today are following some flavor of agile software development cycle. And with that, you have product managers that you work with. You may have project managers that you work with, and you get to work in blocks, in iterative blocks. However, in those sprint blocks, the project managers are managing projects for development, not for technical writers per se, because we being shared resources, we are on multiple product teams, multiple scrum teams. And I think that is it's great, but also it's a disadvantage because now it's up to technical writers to manage their own projects. And with you having this experience in project management, I wanted you to share, were you in such role? And if you can share any tips, any strategies that technical writers can take away, because that's something that I always struggle with. If you have any tools, strategies, I would love to hear about that.
Yeah, sure. So look, I guess for most project managers, documentation, it's just a line item in your schedule, user guide, finalized and approved at X date,
Right.
right? Which, if you're a tech writer, actually there's so much that goes into that, so it really doesn't do it justice. And there's so much more that goes into documentation and planning and a documentation project. And people don't really pay this justice, even though all of us, even if we're not tech writers, we do documentation projects all the time. If you're working in any sort of modern business or government department, you're doing project plans or briefing notes or some sort of document, and they have to go through layers of review, and that could be a really complex process. And particularly for tech writing, when you have to make sure that your documentation is really accurate, the process leading up to that line item, user guide approved, it's a long process and there's a lot of steps along the way. So one thing I've always been really interested in as well, what does the project management of technical documentation look like? That's something I've been doing for a long time over my different roles, particularly my tech writing roles, obviously. And when I was project manager for tech docs at a place called Cochlear as well. So really kind of grappling with that on a kind of global scale with a big global company that does translation as well. Does that answer your question?
It does. I think I want to go into how does a technical writer who may be a lone writer or let's say on a team, but still managing their individual projects, if you had any suggestions on how they could address, because one of the things that I struggle with is with being on multiple projects, how do I track what those projects are? So if you have any tips to inform how I can do better project management.
Yeah, sure. So look, I think the first thing is to kind of recognize that good project management requires a bit of time just in doing that project management aspect, and as tech writers, we tend to want to jump into the work feet first. And people think project management, they think schedules and Gantt charts, but there's a lot more to it than that, right? And there's really, I guess, two main, to me anyway, there's two main sides of project management. And one is the planning. Well, technically before you start, or you might actually practice do it when you started. That's all the thinking that you need up front to plan out your project and get it right. And then there's the tracking, which you mentioned, and that's the ongoing phase. So that's the management over the life of the project. And I think, before I started doing my master's in project management, before I, got more experience in project management, like many people, I kind of just lumped them all together. This is project management. And it's kind of a lot to chew on, it's a lot to digest. So I think the first step is understand that, it's kind of a two-step process. First, you do your planning, and that feeds into your ongoing management. And, starting in that way helps kind of reduce the chaos and a little bit. And then, of course, planning is a process as well, which I'm happy to talk about.
Absolutely. I think that would be great. And I like how you have split that project management, the function into separate roles, because when I think about project management, I'm lumping it all together. Now, something that I do or I have started doing, actually, it's a shout out to a teammate who uses OneNote, and she has a planner that she's created for each team that she's on. And she has all the high level projects that she's working on for a sprint or for a program increment, because we use SAFe. And then she has it's a chart. It's a simple chart. And then as she goes through it, as it moves through the sprint until time to release or go to market, she's tracking it. So it's a very simple way of approaching it. And I started copying her approach to project management. As technical writers, we don't have these any specific tools to manage. In your opinion, is that a good way, or is there a better way that we could approach this using simple tools that we have for access?
Yeah, that's a really good way. Simple tools are the best. And I love just a simple Excel spreadsheet for tracking a project. It's really hard to go past it. It's just so easy to use, and, there's minimal overhead. Yeah, absolutely. I'd recommend that for the tracking.
That's awesome. Now, you said you could share more about the planning phase. Let's talk about it.
Planning is, that's what feeds into your tracking phase, right? So, people sort of expect, if they've just sort of dipped their feet into the water of project management, that, somehow the tracker is, magically appears all, nicely formed, or there's the schedule, right? And there it is. But there's a lot of work that goes into, producing that to getting to that point. And if you just kind of jump straight into the tracking stage, you kind of miss this really big, important thinking aspect of project management, where you do the hard work that gets you to that point, to having a tracker that looks really simple, having a Gantt chart. And basically what that all starts off with is scope definition, right? Yeah, which is figuring out, well, what have I got to do? What are my deliverables, and, what are my topics? In our book, Technical Writing Process, we talk through a really simple kind of scope definition exercise, which is you put together a documentation plan, right? And that talks about your purpose, your audience, your deliverables, and who your review team is. That's kind of your fundamentals. And in your deliverables, depending on how complex they are, you might have a list of topics, if it's a user guide or something like that, or, maybe it's a quick reference guide and it doesn't have a list of topics. It's just an individual document. And that's a great start to planning. For many or most technical writing projects, that's kind of what you need to get off the ground, and to then put that into your tracker, and that lets you can share that with your manager, you can share that with your stakeholders, and you can establish, a really good common understanding of, yep, this is what I'm meant to produce, and these are the dates, and hey, here are all the people who need to sign off on them, and oh gosh, it's a lot more people than we expected, and
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. It's a skill. And I think as you grow in your career, it's something that you cultivate, or that's what I have experienced. So I can speak for myself. Project management, I haven't done any formal education in it. But as you were sharing about how we start thinking about planning, the first thing we as technical writers who are in agile, we start thinking about, okay, what are the high priority features being developed for a particular sprint. So you're kind of aligning your deliverable and your ask and scope with your product backlog in an agile environment. Would that be right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, totally, in an agile environment. But even before you align it, the first thing is, well, what have I, signing up to produce? What is my scope?
Right.
How many deliverables are there? And there's a whole bunch of studies in project management that say that, or to conclude that, defining your scope is one of the biggest success factors in projects. Yeah. So I think even before you align your deliverables with your sprints, you have to just kind of, figure out what that list of deliverables is in the first place. And in project management, that's called, scope, or a work breakdown structure. And the work breakdown structure is something I really love. It's like the greatest tool ever. And not many people know about it, actually, which is weird, because it's the simplest thing. They're a way to help you figure out visually, what do I have to deliver? And basically, it's like a tree structure, right? So tech writers should love them, because we all do tree structures and taxonomies all the time. Yeah, it's a table of contents. And that's what a work breakdown structure is. It says, look, what do I have to deliver in descending levels of granularity, where I can relate each sub-deliverable back up to the parent? So, for tech docs, it might look like, hey, new product launch. That's my parent at the top of the tree.
Mm.
My next level down is, I need a quick reference guide and I need a user guide. Okay, that's my level 2. And my level 3, well, there won't be anything under the quick reference guide, is what it is. But under my user guide, hey, I might have 20 topics under there. So that's what a work breakdown structure is. And that's where I always start. And it's just building a really visual picture of what I have to do. What's the scope of my work? Yeah. And then the process that you follow to execute that, that's kind of like an overlay on top. And that's what your status columns are in your status tracker.
Got it. Now, how does that, I guess what I'm taking away from this conversation is also kind of aligning with your content strategy. So that planning phase is also helping you take a step back from just scheduling and thinking about if this is, let's say, a new team that's been put together or a solo technical writer who's got a team that he or she's on, and thinking about, okay, what am I going to deliver? As you said, you start thinking about the scope, most importantly, what are the deliverables going to be, and then how am I going to release those? So that ties into the product roadmap. And also, you're kind of starting to build a content strategy. Am I far-fetched in saying that, or am I on the right track here?
I mean, look, ideally, you'd have your content strategy before you have your work breakdown structure. But
Got
I
it.
mean, your content strategy might have a list of a whole bunch of deliverables. So I guess, it's a useful tool that you could use anywhere. Depends how granular you want to go to in your content strategy.
Awesome. We were going to touch upon Boffin Education. You did mention a little bit about what we are doing. Share with us about your first book, and then we'll talk about the next book as well.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So the tech writing process, yeah, I published that back in 2015. I was the solo writer on that. So I probably spent, I don't know, maybe 2 years writing it. I can't remember now. It was a while ago. It wasn't even meant to be a book. So it was kind of like this accidental thing. And I'd done this job. I'd been the project manager of tech docs at this biomedical company called Cochlear, who make hearing implants for deaf people. It was a really fascinating job, but a huge challenge for me because I'd never been in an environment before where I was documenting manufactured products. So that was a whole new world for me. They did translation into 42 languages across the world. They had software products, which was cool as well, but all these hardware products. So when I came in, they'd been through this huge restructure and they demolished their tech docs team and it all been scattered to the wind. So I kind of had to invent a tech docs team from scratch and then go execute, with my team. Can't remember how many there were, 6 or 7 or 8. I had to hire them. And then we had to execute this really complicated process where there were deliverables for software, deliverables for hardware, all sorts of things. And in doing so, I started looking around. I thought, gosh, there's got to be some sort of off-the-shelf framework for doing this. And all I could find at the time was 1994 book Joanne Hackos, Managing Your Documentation Projects, which is actually a really fantastic book, but it was really hard to get hold of in Australia back in 2013. So I didn't have much to go on, and eventually we got there, right? We developed the process and through our collective wisdom as tech writers and we figured it out. We made, plenty of mistakes along the way, of course. And when I get to the end of it, I thought, you know what? Actually, this is a really good process I've got here for publishing tech docs in a biomedical environment. What if I can kind of make that into a generic version and publish a little guide on it? That's kind of how it started out. I published a generic version that, I thought people could apply to any scenario. And it was like a 10,000 word little manual. And I sent that around to some friends and they said, hey, Kieran, this is really cool, but you should add this, this, and this. So, okay, I added this, and this, and it grew a little more. I sent it around to some more friends and some colleagues, and it just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger until this thing snowballed into a book. And suddenly I was reaching out to tech writers from all around the world and tech docs managers to, help me review it and fine tune it and validate all the templates and everything. And yeah, that was the 2015 book. And, it seems to have done pretty well. We've sold 8,500, 9,000 copies over the years, and people seem to like it. I had a consultant rush up to me at one of the conferences I spoke to and show me this really dog-eared copy of it with all these post-it notes, and that was just fantastic. Wow, I was like, wow, these people use this thing every day in their daily life and in their work and apply it, and they love it. So that's fantastic.
Well, congratulations. That I'm sure a lot of hard work has gone into this production. And I have a copy of the latest book. And I will say what I like about it is it has made information very accessible. It's very easy to read. And especially when, as technical writers, we are juggling multiple projects and also doing project management and a zillion other things. You want a book that is going to give it to you straight without having to break your head over it. So I highly recommend to my listeners, do check it out, especially if you are new to this role. If you are in a new leadership position, this book will come in extremely handy because it is tailored to technical communicators. I highly recommend that book because I'm using it. And very soon it may be a dog-eared copy for me too. I have it sitting on my desk. I do refer to it, absolutely. Now, did you do this writing while you were doing a full-time job?
Yeah, I did actually. Although I had to take, I did it on evenings and weekends, and I was contracting. So, I wasn't working every
I
day.
see.
Yeah, but look, I did kind of get to the point eventually where I realized, wow, I'm never really going to finish this book if I just do it on weekends and evenings and squeeze in a bit here and there. So I took 3 months off. Yeah, and just to finish it and get it over the line and get it, polished to the level of readability. Like you say, yeah, okay, and thank you very much. It is by readable, right? But as every tech writer knows, the more readable a document is, the simpler it is, the more work you put crewing out.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Exactly. Oh my God, I'm so glad you mentioned that because I've been at companies where the stakeholders that I work with have said, how hard is it to write? Of course, anybody can write. Yes, anybody can write. Absolutely. Content is very easy to create. I was recently talking to somebody and they said, content is so easy to create. Absolutely. But creating meaningful content that is accessible and that is in plain English is the hardest to write. And you validate. So we get each other. It's not easy to write content that is easily scannable because I believe there is a science to it and you have to approach it with that, as you said, cognitive psychology that informs this process. Now, I haven't done any cognitive psychology, but I have read enough on how we process information, what our attention span is. So you start thinking about accessibility, you start thinking about scannability, you start thinking about findability, and then you kind of apply that to the content that you're writing. So I think creating a book or creating any content that requires that approach, there's a lot of work that has gone into it to make it as simple and as accessible as possible to the right audience. We touched upon scoping, and we, as technical writers at companies on product teams, we have, when we start thinking about the project plan now with agile, for me, we are mostly doing online content. We are rarely producing any print content. Would the same process apply to the other communication channels, other content type, in your opinion?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the process at a high level is pretty, you can abstract it to pretty much any, writing projects. Plan, design, write, edit, review, translate if you have to, publish. That's pretty high level stuff. No. And it's not, it's not meant to kind of be like a straitjacket. The way we've written the process is you can take this process and customize it. And I think in the second edition of the book, we have 2 case studies. So we have a case study of, hey, here's company A, and these are all based on real examples from the writing team or, tech writers we interviewed. Company A, they're a startup doing agile software development. Here's what their process looks like, and it's quite abridged and straightforward, but it still uses that terminology of the phases. Company B is a multinational, manufacturing company that does engine parts that go into other machines and ships them all around the world and has printed documentation translated into multiple languages in the box. Yeah, same high level process, but it's got additional steps, that whole translation and production aspect, obviously.
Awesome. Again, coming back to developing these project management skills, I mentioned earlier, this is something that I have over time learned. Now, if we were to offer some advice, if you were to offer some advice or suggestions to writers who are new in their roles to this profession, what kind of skills would you recommend as they start approaching project management?
And I guess my advice would be, look, go get some training.
Mhm.
Project management's not rocket science, but if if you're trying to do it with no, understanding and just you work with project managers and you've seen the output, right? You've seen the trackers, you've seen the schedules. Well, you might go into it with the wrong impression that that's 100% of what project management is, right? But you don't see everything behind it. So you don't understand, well, what are the steps leading up to that? And just like technical writing, project management's a process as well, and it can be learned. And it's pretty straightforward.
Okay, so I'll be very honest. I have a friend who's a project manager. And when I think about the PMI Institute and just the whole process of going through that education and training, it sounds very intimidating as an outsider. And of course, when she talks about her journey, it seems very intimidating. And I'm thinking, I'm a technical writer, I'm working full time, I don't have the chops to go through that education. One, I feel sort of deficient because I feel like there's numbers to it and you're learning budgeting and whatnot. So is this really for me? Now, my question really is, how much do they educate themselves? Because project planning to me seems like there's planning, there's scheduling, and probably budgeting as well. And technical writers rarely manage budgeting. So in your opinion, when you think about these different phases, what should they really focus on when they decide to get themselves educated?
I would focus on doing a kind of fundamentals project management course. Those things you've mentioned, scheduling, budgeting, they all kind of flow from that scope definition that I talked about, right? So once you've got your scope defined, actually it's pretty easy to put that into a schedule. It just kind of translates and flows through. And it's pretty easy to put that into a budget too. And some of this stuff is just, look, you just need a bunch of templates and somebody to show you how, to kind of walk you through that process one time. So that's the kind of training I'd look for. Not for, you don't need PMI certification if you're unless you're really interested in that, which is absolutely fine. But yeah, look for a fundamentals project management course, which takes you through the basics of that. And that skill set of defining your scope, translating that into a schedule, translating that into a budget, you can take that and apply that to tech writing. If they're worth their salt, they'll teach you about risk management as well. Yeah. And those four things I mentioned are essentially, they're the top success factors in project management: scope definition, cost management, time management, risk management, and stakeholder management as well is actually a really important aspect.
Really important. So my follow-up question is, again, as we explore the different options online, one of the things that I wanted to ask was, how do you negotiate with stakeholders while you're getting educated? Because that's one of the biggest challenges that I've had when I am working with stakeholders and setting expectations. I would believe that that is also a part of project management, and negotiation skills probably are also a skill that you need to develop. In your opinion, have you run into situations where you've had to negotiate with stakeholders the scope of a project, and what does that look like, and what skills do I need to cultivate to improve negotiation skills?
And look, I think my answer to that is, well, if you follow the process, that will kind of sort itself out. I mean, you don't have to be, a kind of, influencer extraordinaire or something like that to work your stakeholders. I think you just have to follow the process in the right order and try your best. And essentially, what does a project management manager do when they're figuring out scope, getting agreement with a project, with their stakeholders? So what they do is, they might do a scoping workshop, or for a tech writer, you might interview your key stakeholders, right, at the start of the project. What do you expect me to do? And then you put it into a plan. So you've got to document it. It's got to exist outside your head, because otherwise you don't have any proof of what's been agreed to. And then you have to socialize your plan. So, you've talked to your stakeholders, you've extracted the information from them. And this is exactly what project managers do. They might, if they have a massive project, they might have to hold workshops with multiple people, for each project, break it down, get the whiteboard out, get them all in the room, do a few rounds of that, and create a breakdown structure. For a tech writer, that might just be your documentation plan. And once you've done the interview process, you've extracted the information, you've regurgitated it out on paper, that's great, because you've got an artifact that then everyone can agree on. So that's the first step. You send that around for review. Hopefully all your stakeholders agree on it. Or, obviously this is a real chance to apply your active listening skills and show that, you've been paying attention. So you take on board that feedback, and hopefully what you do is come up with, an agreed baseline, which is, hey, this is the package of documents I'm going to deliver. And we've all agreed on that. And this is a collaborative process that we've all, embarked on together. So, yeah. So hopefully that should be a common understanding.
Collaboration skills, stakeholder interviews, these are things that we already do as technical writers. So bringing those into project management, I suppose, is not a hard ask. It's just pivoting a little bit to work on how you are going to lay your documentation plan. Since we are talking about specifically for technical communicators, yes, a documentation plan is something that I have used in the past to set those expectations. It's an important artifact that you start with and you build on. In your opinion, what are the most high level items one should have in a documentation plan?
It doesn't have to be a full-on project management plan with,
Right, right.
15 subsections. Purpose, audience, deliverables, and your review team are the essentials. So you can remember that with PAD, or Padre, as we call it in the book: purpose, audience, deliverables, and review team.
Interesting. I never knew that.
Yeah.
So the deliverables would also have the timeline. Do we need to be very detailed about our timeline, or that is again something that we can negotiate and pivot on?
Yeah, well, you should negotiate it. So, obviously the business or the organization, they're going to come to you and say, usually, hey, I need these documents by X, right? And often that's driven by a product launch. So,
right.
That might not be something that you can negotiate too much. Yeah. But if you think it's unreasonable, yeah, of course you should have a discussion. If you've been brought on as a solo tech writer and you think, wow, look, this work looks like the job of a dozen tech writers, well, that's not good.
Right.
And you need to have that discussion up front. So yeah, in your documentation plan, alongside your list of deliverables, there should be, some sort of expected delivery date when the organization, your manager, whatever, wants to have them published. You might have to work with them to figure out what's realistic. Absolutely.
So again, with being a solo writer on a team, all the stakeholders want the world of you. They believe that you can deliver everything, and the asks are just coming in. And that is where I've encountered this in my experience, especially with younger writers. They do not know how to say no, and they commit and then later suffer. And I have struggled to, because I'm not a project manager, I'm not a trained one, it's been hard for me to kind of provide them the right support. If somebody's in this sort of a situation, what would you say to them? How do they approach? Because time management is a really big issue in our field. And setting those expectations, it's very hard to say no. I think the reason it may seem like I'm fixated on this question, but I think it's something that also because we are considered as quote unquote cost centers, we rarely have that seat at the table sometimes. Somebody else commits for us and then we are trying to do the deliverable. In those sort of scenarios, what do you have to say?
Yeah, look, I think it's really essential to be able to gatekeep your own work. And like you say, it's really tempting just to say yes to everything, be the most agreeable and productive person in the team, but that can totally burn you out. So you don't want to do that. You don't want to be in that situation where you're super stressed and overcommitted. And really experienced tech writers and really experienced knowledge workers know how to guard their time really well. And they're really good at that. They're really good at that, pushing back. So if you've worked with senior writers or senior folks, you'll find that one thing they're really good at is saying no. And that's okay to do. But look, what I would say to a junior writer is, well, firstly, do your planning, right? Do your documentation plan, understand what the scope is. So if somebody asks you to do a new piece of work, how many documents do they want to write? Make a list. If it's a big user guide, make a list of topics. Try and figure out, well, how long is this going to take me? If I take a week or 3 days on each topic, and I have to take, 2 weeks on reviewing them all. Well, how long is that actually? How long do I think it's going to take? Have a try at planning that out. Even if it's not particularly sophisticated, it doesn't matter. That's something you can take to your manager and work with them and say, hey, I've got all this work on, and they might not be aware of it, because subject matter experts, stakeholders, they love to go directly to the most productive tech writer in the team and short circuit everything, person who always says yes. So you got to work with your manager. And if they're a good manager, they're going to be someone who can help you, say no and push back on that and say, hey, sorry, stakeholder, this is a fantastic piece of work you want me to do, but my manager's told me no. So have that conversation. It's essential.
Yeah. What you brought up is estimation. And even for experienced writers, sometimes it's very hard to estimate how long this is going to take, especially if it's a whole new set of content and different channels that it's going to be published in. But going back to the basics, let's say I'm writing a user guide or a quick start guide for somebody who has not created that content, but is now going to be creating that content. Somebody that is new, be it a new writer or just somebody who is experienced, but focusing on something entirely new, a new set of content channel. How do they estimate not having a baseline? What should they think about?
The more experience we have, well, we develop our own baseline.
Exactly.
Right? It becomes a lot easier. You can instantly look at a project. Wow, that's got 20 topics. And particularly if you've been in the company for a while, oh, this topic looks like it's on a really tricky module of the new system. And I think that's going to take me 2 weeks. But if you don't have that experience, what do you do? Right. So the first step is, well, like I said, and I feel like I'm broke a record to myself, but you've got to figure out the scope. So you've got to break it down and figure out exactly what the topics are. And then, talk to people, right? So if there are other tech writers around, well, how long does it take them to make a topic of this size? And you can get an idea. And usually there will be someone there who's done some work before who can give you a rough idea of how long it took them. If there absolutely isn't, and there isn't anyone there you can talk to, and there's no one at all, well, you can have a try at it. So you could write a topic or two and say to your manager, look, I really don't know. There's no other tech writers at this fictional company, right? No one's done this before. This is uncharted territory. So I'm going to write 1 or 2 topics, and then I'm going to figure out and get back to you what the timeline's going to look like, because then I'll have a better idea.
That's fair. Now, I've not worked for a startup. Usually with tech companies, you have the benefit of time to create a documentation plan or project plan. With startups, do they have this benefit where they can create these detailed or even high-level documentation plans? Is this something that you recommend? Because I recently attended a webinar where a technical writer who's working in startups talked about how you approach creating content for a startup, but she didn't really touch upon how you project plan for whatever you're going to be working on. But in your opinion, would the process be the same? Or because you're on this accelerated track, would that process be condensed? And is it a good idea to do it when you're in a startup environment?
I have a startup, so I can answer that question from my perspective as the founder of a startup. And if I hired a tech writer and asked them to produce a bunch of docs, and they said, "Yeah, I'm going to spend 2 weeks creating an incredibly exquisitely detailed documentation plan first," I wouldn't be impressed. And like you say, you've got to be mindful of the company scenario. So, if I was in the startup, I would do a documentation plan, because, startups can be pretty chaotic places and people can get swamped with work.
Yeah.
So even if it's just a list of deliverables, right, that would be a place to start. What are my deliverables? When am I agreed to produce them by? What's the expectation? And what do the topics look like underneath them? And I think if you only have that, well, at least you've got your scope defined and you've got a nominal deadline, and that kind of reduces that swirling chaos to a list on it that you can then put in a status tracker and start, tracking and marking down as you hit and complete those deliverables. I think that's essential. I would do that anywhere, even a startup. That's
awesome. It gives me a lot more confidence. A few years ago, I was invited by a startup and I was interviewed, and I guess, had this imposter syndrome where I felt like I wasn't good enough and I rejected that offer. And for this very reason, where I felt like I was inept. However, now I have some confidence and I feel like, okay, this is up my alley. But one of the things that came up in that interview was budgeting, because they said, we have the budget in case you want to expand the team. So we are hiring you as a lone writer, but if you want to expand the team. Now, throughout this conversation that we've had, at least in my experience, I've not had to deal with budgeting. But if we had to add that layer to our project management as a technical writer for a startup, what would your advice be?
Yeah, like my advice would be, go do that fundamentals course on project management.
I see.
Equip yourself with that knowledge, but don't be intimidated by it as well. Because budgeting it's actually not a complex process. And if you look at a budget, it breaks down, it's linked to your work breakdown structure, right? So a budget is just transposing the scope of what you have to produce and
Hmm.
putting, like an hourly rate against that, essentially, and then plotting that out for every month. Yeah. So it's pretty straightforward, but maybe you just need the template to do that. And actually also realize that it is a two-step process, right? Like if someone asks for a budget for a tech docs project, you don't just materialize a budget out of the blue. First you have to do that scope definition, figure out what
Right.
you've got to produce. Like that's that estimation. And then you've got to estimate, well, how much work is involved. So as you mentioned, you got to know how much time is it going to take me or a writer to write these topics. So that's really important. And then if you know the scope and you know the work breakdown and the effort involved, 3 days to produce a topic or whatever, and you know the cost of your tech writers on an hourly basis or a daily basis, well, that's all you need for your budget. You're ready to go. Basically, you just need a template and maybe someone to walk you through that process one time. And it's super straightforward.
You simplified that so beautifully, Kieran. It doesn't sound as intimidating as I was listening to you share how you can simplify that process by breaking it down. We have covered a good chunk of questions about project management. Is there anything that you would like to add in addition to everything that we've talked about?
Well, look, you touched on it before, Zora. You talked about the psychological
Yes.
aspects, and
Yes.
that's also something I'm really interested in. Where when we were writing the second edition of the tech writing process, we kind of bolted on it this additional layer of information, which is the concepts, right? The why.
Why?
I didn't have that in the first book. I wanted it to be a really practical book for practitioners. They could just pick up and there wouldn't be any of this annoying, irrelevant fluff which explain why you do these. And for the second book, I thought, well, no, actually, that's a bit of an oversight. I really want to know why now, right? So what we started doing is for every chapter, okay, you want to include screenshots and documentation. You want to include diagrams. Well, why do you do that? So we started going on this journey of, well, let's find the why for every practice, every how to do something in tech writing. And we sort of stumbled into this whole field of cognitive psychology, which is really, really kind of well known in the field of education and instructional design. It's all based on how the brain works and how we process information. And crazily enough, it's not very big in tech writing, which is weird. That just seems to me like this huge oversight that tech writers, unlike educators, aren't trained in the basics of psychology, so they understand how the brain processes information, right? Things like, what do we have? The multimedia learning effect, right? So that's a really simple principle. It's all about words and pictures together, which is something that every tech writer does. We know, hey, if we want to create some great documentation, we want to bring words and pictures together. And that's really effective. And we all know that, right? Because that's what we all want when we consume documentation. But why is that? Right. And like, okay, I know that instinctively to be true. That's what a good tech writer does. So if you go and, delve into cognitive psychology, that gives you the why. And actually what it tells you is that your brain kind of it's like a dual core processing computer, right? One core processes images and one core processes text. And what that means is if you look at a document with images and text, you're doing that in parallel. So what your brain's doing, it's absorbing almost twice as much information in the same time. And that's why it's good to have images accompanied by text and vice versa. That's the why. So that's the other thing, Zora. That's the thing that kind of interests me. So if people want to know what the difference is, I guess, between our first and second book, there you go. We've added a bit of interesting why is that into the second edition.
It's true that as a technical writer, until recently, I did not think about how psychology informs what I write and why I need to write it a certain way. I believe it was one of my guests who talked about I think it was from TechSmith, who mentioned our attention spans are so short that as we are consuming content, we want to accelerate. Our attention spans are so short that you want to push content at a rapid pace so that information overload is happening.
Look, I think you want to avoid information overload. That's a thing called the working memory bottleneck, which is really well known in psychology. And the idea is, you've got Like if you imagine a kind of a bow tie shape, right? So on one side of the bow tie, it's got this funnel, and that's funneling in all the information from the outside world, which is limitless, right?
Right.
There's so much. There's the internet. I'm looking out the window. There's trees and birds and stuff, right? So there's a lot happening. And then the other side of the funnel, right? The other side of the bow tie is your long-term memory, which is what you actually retain upstairs. And, that doesn't last, that kind of diminishes over time. We forget things, but, we can store a lot there. But in order to get there, we have to put it through this, really narrow choke point, this pinch point called our working memory, where we process information. It's incredibly limited. We can only really grasp 2 or 3 up to 4 chunks of information at once. That's what the science tells us.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
yeah, right. So people who are really good natural educators or natural, speakers or presenters, they know this intuitively. They understand, I don't want to overload my audience with information, right? Really good tech writers know that. I don't want to overload the people with information. That's why I chunk things up.
And actually,
Right?
this ties back beautifully to project management. And I'll tell you why. As you're doing your scoping and your estimation, you're not writing everything about the product. You are going to write what 80% of your users are going to consume.
Yep.
Right? And address that first, not the edge cases.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? That I think it's called the 80-20 rule. So you start thinking about eventual progressive disclosure. So you start small and then you add more layers of content. So as you're thinking out how the project plan is going to be, what are your deliverables going to be, start thinking about who are the customers that need the most handholding. And you're going to address those issues first before you start writing for every audience that exists, because that is humanly not possible. So that also should inform how you project plan. What do you have to say to that? You think I'm thinking right here?
Oh, definitely. Look, I think that sounds to me like the Pareto principle, right? Which is the 80-20 rule. And,
Yes.
I'm probably hideously misquoting it, but I think it's something like 80% of the problems are caused by 20% of the causes, like that.
Yeah, that might be right. That might be right. And again, I should probably also look it up. I know of the 80-20 rule. And when I approach writing, I'm thinking, who's the audience? What is the majority of them? And how can I solve their problem? That information comes through analytics, through the user feedback. So there's this communication loop that has to be set up. So really keeping it simple, keeping it small, and iteratively building on it. Some of the principles that we leverage,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Your minimum viable product of documentation, right?
MVP, right?
Totally.
Absolutely.
It's tempting for tech writers to go on, we love to document everything, right? So it's tempting to go on a journey where we have to capture every edge case.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's your natural tendency. Well, you can work to avoid that, but it's something you consciously have to do. I know myself, I've got to include everything, and I have to be conscious. Hey, hang on a minute. What am I doing here? Let's try and narrow it down to the important stuff.
Yeah. Keeping it simple is important. Sometimes there may be a need to over communicate, but there also you need to think about why you need to over communicate. You have to think about the why. That why is going to be your guide. And that's something that I'm starting to apply to when I'm writing. Why do I need to say this? And then I tie that to my persona type and say, okay, does this user have the information? If not, it's okay to over communicate or progressively disclose that in a separate topic so that they don't have everything on one page, because that also creates that information overload. So you can have all that information, but how are you going to chunk it down so that it is consumable and accessible, right? So there are different strategies, but such a fun conversation, Kieran. Thank you so much for your time. I want to return you to your family, to your young newborn, and have a great weekend. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, Zora. Lovely talking to you, and hi to your audience, and I'll talk with you soon.
Subscribe to the podcast on your favorite app, such as Apple, Spotify, or YouTube Music. For the latest on my show, follow me on LinkedIn or visit me at www.insidetechcom.show. Catch you soon on another episode.